Mr. Sibulela, you are on mute.
I didn't realize that I was on mute. I thought, Nadia, you are taking care of that. My apologies. A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are enjoined here today by the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, together with the Competition Commission, as well as all the agencies of the Department of Trade, Industry and Commission, under the leadership of the Honorable Minister, Ibrahim Patel, in the main to talk about issues that face and continue to face South Africans on the regulation of prices. My name is Siyabulela Makunga. I am the spokesperson for the Competition Commission of South Africa. I have been requested to facilitate today's virtual session, which under normal circumstances would have been a face-to-face session with our stakeholders, because we believe that we have an obligation to share insights and perspectives on matters that affect our consumers and customers on a day-to-day basis. I am assisted by my colleagues from all the agencies of the DTIC in running this show. So at this juncture, I would like to thank everyone for having joined us for this joint stakeholder engagement session on a matter that obviously has been a thorn to vulnerable consumers and customers. I would like to just take you down the memory lane to say that on this day back in 2020, when the country was plunged into what was fast becoming a second pandemic called price gouging, one of the biggest national wholesale distributor, Discam, was found guilty of excessive pricing on surgical masks during the state of the national disaster, as was announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa. The tribunal had ordered that Discam should pay an administrative penalty of 1.2 million for contravening Section 8 of the Competition Act. Discam had inflated a pack of 50 masks from 43 rands 47 cents excluding VAT per unit to about 156 rands 95 cents, a price increase of 261%. And this is a case that has attracted the interest of the president and the cabinet. We're all appalled that there were companies who would go to the extent of inflating prices for essential goods such as masks, which at the time were in demand due to the pandemic of COVID-19. So today we are to hear about proactive steps that the DTIC, the Competition Commission, as well as the National Consumer Commission and other regulators had taken in protecting vulnerable consumers as well as customers. And maybe just to take you through the housekeeping rules, we are streaming live on various social media platforms, which obviously include our YouTube channels, our Facebook, on Competition Commission SA, the DTIC, as well as Proudly South African. And we are inviting all consumers. I know this is the session that they all have been waiting for. And today presents us with that opportunity to be able to engage all the regulators, the practitioners, as well as people behind the investigations of these cases, and understand the complexities that inform the decisions that the Commission and other regulators take in ensuring that consumers are protected. And to take us through these intricacies, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce to you our panel. We've got Mr. Sipho Mtombeni, who is the principal analyst from the Competition Commission of South Africa. We also have got Mr. Joseph Selelo, who is the company secretary for the National Consumer Commission. We also have got Ms. Mahauta Mpahlela, who is the Ombuds for Consumer Goods and Services. We're also joined by an academic, Professor Willem Boshoff, who's the director for the Center for Competition Law and Economics at the Stellenbosch University in the Western Cape. At this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Willem Boshoff to just give us insights and perspectives in terms of how they see the regulation and pricing in South Africa, and whether or not some of the prices we've seen astronomically increased, especially during the time of a pandemic, if these prices were justifiable, and whether or not the regulators are doing enough to make sure that consumers and customers are protected. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity, and good afternoon to everyone. I think it's perhaps useful to start by giving a bit of an overview of how prices are expected to evolve over the next year or two, just broadly, before we talk perhaps about some problems and issues, and of course there are quite a number. As we know, the economic fallout from the pandemic has created great hardship for many South Africans, and the impact has also been seen not just in terms of economic growth or recession, but also in pricing. Quite a number of sectors, because of the lockdown last year, saw a sharp decline in activity and also a sharp fall in prices. And what has happened since then, as the economy has started reopening, and as we gradually come to terms with the pandemic and economic growth resumes, you'll see some acceleration in prices, but a lot of that is driven by the fact that prices were quite under pressure, at least in some sectors, last year. Of course, that does not take away from the example that you've already mentioned, and which we'll no doubt hear more of later today, that there has been price increases in especially essential especially essential goods last year, and that you continue to see price pressures, especially for food. And so the expectation over the next year or two, short-term price expectations, is that food prices will continue to be to surprise. They may well surprise on the upside, and also that other international commodity prices, which find their way into our prices, things like the international oil prices, which drive our petrol prices, will also drive inflation over the next year or over the next year or so. So there's certainly, I think, one of the key themes that one should keep in mind as we think about how prices are likely to behave in the next year or so is indeed the impact that the international economy has on us as a small economy. And of course, food prices, you see that international prices for wheat and for maize and other commodity prices for mined commodities, these have all experienced quite a surge over the past few months, of course, as economies reopen, and there's increased demand for them, and they then filter through to our prices. So, so that I think is something it's important. But of course, at the same time, while you have this pressure on prices from the international side, it's true, and we all know that the economy is not doing that great. And of course, there's great pressure on a lot of sectors. And you also see that, for example, in the price of various services, services inflation, which is quite subdued. So if you think about all the office buildings, for example, that are empty, or at the moment still empty, or the retail space which is under pressure. So there are areas in the economy where price pressure is actually quite weak. So these two things are, playing off against one another. But the expectation is still that inflation will remain, that in other words, the price increases in the economy at large will remain below the Reserve Bank's target of between 3 and 6%. So that's what's helped them to maintain lower interest rates and try and help us recover. So I think that's just important just to see how these international developments are driving on us, our experience, and how our local economic conditions may be working in an opposite direction. And I think that's also a useful starting point if we want to talk about today lots about specific products where we might say, well, it might be true across the board. Maybe prices are not increasing everywhere or for all items, but of course we know there are specific areas where prices have risen quite sharply. So I think when we want to talk about that and try and understand what is going on, it's always quite useful to keep in mind that the price of anything is driven by basic economics. So demand on the one side and cost on the other side. So if there's high demand for a product, and of course the masks is an extreme example, then prices tend to rise. If costs go up for companies, then prices also tend to rise. So those two things work together. And so you should always keep in mind both when you're trying to figure out what's driving a price and whether it is really permissible, whether we should worry about that. And of course, if we want to think about ways of dealing with those, with price pressures. So in the case of, and of course, let me focus on, let's say, food and some other essential goods. Of course, during the pandemic, there was a huge surge in demand, say, for hand sanitizer or masks, or and of course, we also remember the toilet roll episode where everybody was buying. There's a huge sudden surge in demand because they were afraid they wouldn't get any. So these things, of course, drive prices. Now, especially when you are in a crisis period, as we perhaps still are, but particularly at the start in last year, when you have such a sudden surge in demand, then that often creates concerns, and my colleagues on the panel will talk about that, competition concerns or other consumer concerns that prices might have risen too sharply. And so, but then one should also keep in mind that if you think about how scarce masks and other essential goods were at the start of the lockdown, and how after a month or two, actually, it was quite readily available. So I'm trying to understand why is that the case. So today we don't no longer worry about getting access to hand sanitizer or masks because it's everywhere you go you can buy masks, but that wasn't the case last year in March. And it's important to keep that in mind because that initial increase in prices was an important signal to the businesses and the manufacturers to start producing more and delivering that to the market. So I think that's the first kind of viewpoint. So yes, demand can push prices very high, but then that is also an incentive for businesses to start producing more. That, of course, doesn't mean that, as we now know, there are quite a number of cases where it may be in the short run not possible for firms to start producing more or for other firms to enter. And in those cases, you have these competition problems about which you will talk about later. So I think, if you're trying to understand prices, if you're trying to understand food prices in South Africa, the same thing comes out. So in food prices, of course, it's probably less a demand issue than a cost issue. So as I said, internationally, prices of wheat and maize and all sorts of commodities have risen quite sharply. And so it takes a while to filter through to the consumer. So again, in that case, you can often say, oh, so supply or cost is driving the price increases. But it's again, and of course, let me add, depending on what drives the price, you can have different possibilities of policy options to try and say, well, how can I make things better for poor consumers, for example? The moment you think about cost-driven price increases, then of course it's much more challenging, because now you need to think, how can I, because certainly it's difficult to say the businesses need to take the brunt in terms of the cost increase. So how do you manage that? So that's a major challenge. It's probably beyond any of us. Certainly in the long run, there are certain long run things the government tries to do, manage the macroeconomy well, try to ensure stable financial conditions, and that gives us the exchange rate a bit of support and things like that. But that's more difficult to manage. But of course, there are other issues over which we might well have control. Perhaps the problem is, well, if you have a big demand increase, we actually don't want the prices to remain very high. We want more firms to enter. And in those cases, the challenge is, of course, one of competition. Is it easy for new firms to enter, or is it easy for existing firms to offer more? And how do we make sure that there is sufficient competition between them, so that if they do experience a cost increase or they do experience a demand increase, that they actually compete so that prices don't stay high forever? So I think that is the challenge in South Africa, and you can already hear that it's quite complicated, because how do you get more competition going? The same problem with the cost. Yes, you can do some things to enhance competition, but it's not as if government has a button it can press somewhere and get more competition going and less competition. And that's why we have, and my colleagues on the panel are representatives of those bodies. We have a number of authorities that deal with these different aspects. So they can say, well, under situations where we know competition is a bit limited, and therefore you might have one or two firms only able to supply, we don't want them to push prices beyond a level, an excessive level, especially in a crisis period. So under those conditions, that's been quite important. Let me say something more about that. I think, especially as far as pricing is concerned, I think our authorities, especially here, I think about the competition authorities, because I'm more familiar with them, and I'm sure my colleagues from the other bodies can also offer their own examples. But certainly, our authorities have been quite active in pricing related issues over the past 10 or more years. So sometimes price increases have nothing to do with demand or cost. They can just be perhaps 2 or 3 suppliers are talking to one another, colluding, trying to jointly reduce competition between themselves and set a nice price, or they might rig a tender process to try and split the market between them. And these kinds of things have an impact on prices. So one would expect over time that all the interventions that we have seen over the past 10 or 15 years by the Competition Commission and the other the tribunal and so on, that should have a positive impact in terms of at least preventing very large price increases in specific sectors, or at least signaling to firms that if they do try to do things that are not probably above board, then they will probably be prosecuted. Doesn't mean that there's not always some cases to prosecute. The Competition Commission is very busy, as they will tell you. But I think it is always, again, there are also limitations to what the Commission can do. At the end of the day, it really remains absolutely vital for the entire government across all our different departments and bodies to get an approach that enhances economic growth and the growth of businesses and the entry of new competitors. And that, because that is what ultimately keeps prices keeps price increases at bay. I think that's going to be the challenge. And as we try and get to that point, we are supported by various bodies to try and prevent the worst problems. So I think that with that I will stop, and I will give over to my other colleagues to talk maybe more specifically about their own experiences with in managing and dealing with pricing issues in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Willem Boshoff from the University of Stellenbosch. Professor is the Director for the Center of Competition Law and Economics. He teaches competition economics and econometrics, and he holds a PhD in economics from the Stellenbosch University, as well as MSc in management from Oxford University. He is a very active academic in terms of formulating competition policy, as well as doing consulting work in competition. Without further ado, I would like to invite our own practitioner and specialist in dealing with matters of competition regulation, Mr. Sipho Mtombeni, to just take us through some of the cases that the Commission has dealt with during this time of difficulty. And maybe if there are lessons that the Commission has learned from those few cases. Sipho Mtombeni, over to you.
Thank you, Sia. So I'll just touch base on the generally around the activities of the Commission during this period, which were largely two-pronged. They were both from an advocacy point of view, so non-enforcement means, but also those that we had through the enforcement means, which are obviously what's more well known. So as you would know, the Commission obviously itself is a regulatory body which is mandated to ensure that to control and investigate restrictive vertical practices and horizontal practices and abuse of dominance, obviously, in the sector. But we also, the main objective of the Commission itself is to promote and maintain competition in South Africa. We would do this obviously in the number of different manners that I have explained. But the reason why we do what we do, I think, is always the question. But the Commission does this in order to ensure that there is efficiency in the market and the development of the market. We wish to provide consumers with choice in terms of products and also competitive prices. We also want to ensure that there is employment and social welfare within the country. Obviously, then also for the country itself to be competitive globally. We are concerned about the opportunities for SMEs and HDIs to participate in the South African economy. And a lot of activities that we do are in trying to make sure that these are the objectives that are met. In terms of what has happened then in relation to the COVID-19 period, shortly following the announcement of the national disaster, the TIC published regulations in relation to price gouging, in terms of which the Commission, along with the NCC, would engage in investigating cases of price gouging and excessive pricing within the sector. The guidelines themselves that were published, the regulations that were published, really touched about suppliers charging excessive prices for certain specific goods and services. These were mainly basic food items and consumer items, but also medical and hygiene supplies and other emergency products and services. In support of this as well, the regulations on block exemptions were also published, which were allowed for the exemption of categories of anti-competitive agreements from being exempted from sections 4 and 5 of the Act itself. We also noted some changes around some of the other authorities, like the tribunal itself. We've made changes to try and make sure that the cases around price gouging would be handled more faster and expeditiously. In relation to the block exemptions regulations themselves, I'll start there and then I'll get to the price gouging regulations there. I know there's a little bit more interest in those ones. The block exemptions themselves really were set in place in order to allow groups of stakeholders where they could approach the Commission and say to the Commission, well, there's a certain category of agreements or agreements that they want to enter into that would assist their business operations, but in the normal course of business would be regarded as anti-competitive. The Commission with the DTIC would obviously then consider these applications and determine whether a sector exemption could be granted. We have seen in the period about 5 exemptions that have been received, one in the healthcare sector, which allowed for the coordination of supply, especially in relation to health services, and also one in banking sector in order to allow for debt relief measures. We've seen one in the retail property industry, in order to allow rental relief measures during this COVID period. The 4th one was in relation to the hotel industry, again, also in relation to availing spaces for quarantine purposes. We've also seen one in the liquid fuels sector. So these exemptions, again, are a way in which the Commission has tried to alleviate some of the effects, as the Professor has alluded to, in terms of the economic activity arising from the COVID pandemic itself, but also the lockdowns that had arisen. In relation to the excessive pricing investigations themselves, which we have seen since March 2020, the Commission has received over 2,000 complaints to date in relation to possible price gouging conduct. We have some of these also relate to the Commission's own investigations and initiations that the Commission itself, through information it has received. To a large extent, the cases that the Commission has received has been against retailers, traders, suppliers, and pharmacies, as well in relation to products such as masks and sanitizers, PPE, and also essential goods such as basic food items. These cases are obviously then investigated in relation to the excessive pricing regulations of the Act, and including the recent amendments to Section 8 of the Competition Act, where an excessive pricing maybe when I'm just to give an understanding or an explanation, refers to a price for a good or service which bears no reasonable relation to the economic value of that service or good, or is higher than the value of the good or service. I know it may be a little bit of a technical explanation of an excessive price, but I think it does to some extent give you some basic understanding as to what is then considered. In terms of Section 8 of the Act, then the excessive pricing is prohibited, especially if it is to the detriment of consumers by a dominant firm. Section 7 of the Act itself talks to what a dominant firm is and what it would be regarded as a dominant firm. I think one of the things that came out of the jurisprudence also is just around the threshold for dominance in relation to the 5 million rands value which need to be considered as for a party to be considered as a dominant firm. Over and above the cases that we have received, the Commission has also been engaging in a number of other cases in public procurement. Just to kind of close off on the excessive pricing cases, we have received, as I've said, the number of cases. A lot of these cases have also been settled and concluded. We've had to date approximately 35 settlement agreements with a number of parties in the sector, a lot of which changed conduct. So they would change how they would do their pricing, but also some of these related to the payment of fines to the reserve. But also some of them related to donations to those needy, and also, at the time, but also to the Solidarity Fund itself. So I think approximately over 15 million rand has been collected in relation to these settlements with parties in the investigation of these matters. The Commission itself, as I mentioned, has also been engaging in public procurement investigations. As you may know, we're part of the Fusion Center, which was created by the President in order to investigate issues around the procurement of PPE. Obviously, again, the same issue, similar issues arise here, where in procurement by public institutions, there is anti-competitive conduct which relates to the pricing of that products that they're procuring, and obviously then being led to excessive prices being charged. We have referred to date, I think some of the more popular cases that are known are the Blue Collar and the Tsumani cases, which relate to sanitizers and surgical masks, which have been referred to the Commission related to public procurement in this manner. Obviously, the Commission continues to engage with our relevant parties in the various sectors and within the regulatory field in terms of issues around public procurement. Over and above the investigative powers of the Commission, I think one of the important things that we've also engaged on in the last year was a food price monitoring, where we've been monitoring the prices of essential food items in order to understand what is happening in terms of retail level inflation, and also to see where there are issues that are arising possibly for enforcement if necessary in certain sectors. The Commission has to date published about 4 reports. We published in March of this year the fourth quarter report, which really also looked at issues around. So we updated, for instance, our analysis in relation to some of the essential food items that we've been looking at over the last year. But also other issues such as pricing on nutrition, also and its effect on nutrition for South Africans, which is also a global factor that we're seeing arising. That the issues that are coming about in relation to price gouging or increased pricing are leading to aspects, socioeconomic aspects, where we are seeing that it's affecting nutrition of South Africans, where a lot more people who are food insecure are becoming a lot more food insecure. And the numbers of those food insecure are also increasing. The report and monitoring report itself, for instance, the previous one would have also looked at specific markets. I know ginger and garlic was one of the things that came about, especially in December and January of this year, where we saw a lot of noise on social media about the prices of garlic and ginger. And we've seen some of the changes, and there is factors that are leading to those prices that are dominant in the market. But also, we've also seen some changes in relation to, for instance, maize and maize meal markets. And I think, as the professor pointed out, that some of the global factors that have affected the South African market, that is even despite a bumper crop that we've had in this year, so we've still seen prices increasing in those sectors, again, because of international factors. So to a large extent, I think, see, I'll leave it there. That is the kind of the global universe of the activities that the Commission has been engaging in relation to pricing and pricing issues around the COVID period. And then I think the rest we'll probably deal with in the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Sipho. Ladies and gentlemen, Sipho is the principal analyst at the Competition Commission of South Africa. Sipho is working in the advocacy division of the competition. He joined the commission back in 2007, and he has operated in various functions across the institution. He holds an LLB degree from the University of Pretoria, as well as a Master of Business Administration from Gibbs. One thing that Sipho, I think, would like to come back to, or which I know he has forgot to mention, is that the case on Dis-Chem and many other, where there have been astronomical increases or inflation of foodstuffs as well as basic services and goods, is that one of the cases has attracted the attention of the president as well as cabinet. And I think it formed part of the periodic addresses that the president has been making since the announcement of the state of national disaster. It is a case where the president at some point had said that he had not imagined that there would be companies who would inflate basic services as well as essential goods, including face masks and sanitizers, by over 261%. He has called this inhumane and referred to those companies as equivalent to murderers, because you would remember that the president as well as cabinet has called on all parties to help government flatten the curve of the country. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Mr. Joseph Silalo. He is the company secretary from the National Consumer Commission. The Competition Commission, together with the DTIC, has been working very closely with the NCC in terms of resolving some of the cases. We would like Joe to just give us some insight in terms of the work that the NCC has been doing, and just maybe dealing with some of the consumer rights that have been tampered with when it comes to prices during this difficult time of the pandemic. And what type of complaints did the Commission deal with, and what kind of mitigation measures are in place or were in place when dealing with those cases? Mr. Joseph Silalo, please take it away.
Thank you, Siabulela. Good day, everyone. The National Consumer Commission, and for these purposes, I will use the acronym NCC, just to make sure that, because we have two commissions here, just to make sure for disambiguation purposes. The NCC is a creature of statute created by the Consumer Protection Act. Now, the Consumer Protection Act, as the name suggests, is an act of parliament that is designed solely to protect consumers from unfair business practices. Now, the NCC is then responsible to enforce the provisions of the Consumer Protection Act through consumer education, business education, and prosecution where prohibited conduct has been found. Now, the mandate of the NCC is quite broad, but the overriding theme is that the NCC seeks to then ensure that consumers receive the quantity and quality of the goods that they purchased, and that the terms of the contracts are then fair. Now, during this period where we are in, where the pandemic is prevalent, we have seen an increase in a number of undesirable practices or business practices. We have seen an increase in the phenomenon called price gouging. We have seen an increase in online scam as well as pyramids, and the NCC then had to intervene on behalf of the consumers. Shortly after the state of emergency was declared, the regulation 350 was promulgated. Now, what the regulation 350 did was to then give a definition to what was already in the Consumer Protection Act. Section 49 of the Consumer Protection Act said that a supplier must not supply or offer to supply goods at a price that is unjust, unfair, or unreasonable. However, these concepts were not defined, and then the regulations then came along and gave a definition. Then it then says that a price will be unfair, unjust, or unreasonable if that price does not correspond to or is not equivalent to the increase in the cost of providing that goods. In other words, an increase must be related to the cost of procurement of those goods. Now, together with the Competition Commission, a number of investigations were conducted, and indeed there have been a number of suppliers that were then found to have contravened the Consumer Protection Act as well as Regulation 350, and those were then prosecuted in the National Consumer Tribunal, and a variety of fines was then imposed. In addition to the fines that were imposed, there have been redress to some of the consumers that lodged the complaints, where they were refunded, and these suppliers were in other instances then directed to make donations of this protective equipment to various NGOs in the areas where they carry on business. For example, if the supplier would have been carrying on business in Nelspruit as an example, then an NGO would be identified in that area, and a donation would then be made to those NGOs. One needs to state that in South Africa, prices in general are not regulated, so there is no price control. However, the CPA says whatever the price that a supplier charges must not be unreasonable, unfair, or unjust. Now, the definition of that term has been introduced by the regulations to say that there must be a correlation between the increase in the price of the specific item with the price of procurement. Then that requires us to then investigate the pricing at the source to see if there was indeed an increase. So for now, I will just leave it at that, at this broad introduction, and we will deal with the matters as we carry on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prajo Selalo. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to use this opportunity to just remind our attendants that we can be able to ask directly through the chat box questions to our speakers. I will also be assisted by my colleagues in terms of raising some of the questions. Mr. Joseph Selelo, thank you very much for that very informative input. I do wish to ask the regulators to, at a later stage, maybe share with our viewers at home as to what processes should they follow in terms of lodging complaints, and when does the commissions investigate matters, if they are able to give an indication in terms of the turnaround, and during this time, what other platforms that are available to the public for them to lodge these kind of complaints. Mr. Joseph Velapis Lelo is the company secretary for the National Consumer Commission. Thank you very much, Dr. Joe, for making that distinction, because we have always had a situation where the public tend to confuse the two commissions in terms of the mandates and the role they play, especially in the matter that has got to do with prices. He's an admitted attorney and consummate consumer law practitioner who has successfully prosecuted matters in terms of the National Credit Act and the Consumer Protection Act. He's been with the NCC since 2016 as a director of prosecutions. We have heard from the academia in terms of really the trend and insights as they observe the work of the regulators. And it does look like the regulators have been looking for one thing and one thing only: the justification of the surge of prices, especially for a basic food, as well as essential goods, foodstuff, as well as essential goods, especially during the time of the pandemic. At this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to call to the fore Ms. Magauta Mphahlele, who is the Ombuds for Consumer Goods and Services. I'll tell you why this office is important. This is an office which becomes the representative of the public, where they deal with matters that are being escalated and concerns and complaints by members of the public, but also it really oversees the work that the regulators are doing in really dealing with the scourge of price hikes, especially at the time of the pandemic. Ms. Mphahlele, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Program Director, and welcome to everybody who has joined this webinar. The Consumer Goods and Services Ombudsman is very different from everyone who has spoken currently. We are not a regulator or an enforcement body. We are responsible for mediating disputes between suppliers of goods and services in South Africa. We have been in existence since 2013. And during that time, we have received more than 51,000 complaints and closed more than 40,000. So obviously the pandemic raised a lot of issues that were not necessarily fully addressed in the Consumer Protection Act, and not all of them related to pricing. And even where they were related to pricing, we had to focus on everything other than price gouging, as the other regulators had done. So what I'm going to do is to share my screen just to give you a short presentation on the type of issues that we had to deal with. as the Ombudsman. One of the questions that was asked is, what are the rights of consumers in terms of pricing? And I think the main discussion today has focused on pricing that should not be unfair, unreasonable, or unjust. But there are other sections in the Consumer Protection Act that relate to pricing, and those are the types of complaints that we as an entity had to deal with. For example, the CPA says that there should be no discriminatory pricing based on Section 9 of the Constitution. And those are related to you cannot discriminate in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of age, in terms of religion, in terms of sexual orientation. So pricing cannot be differentiated unless under very different circumstances. But we must also understand, and I saw one of the questions on the chat boxes, the CPA does not apply to regulated prices. So your municipal tariffs, your telecom tariffs, those are not regulated because they are regulated somewhere else, and there is a public consultation process that would usually happen, and individuals and citizens have the right to participate. For example, the National Electricity Energy Regulator would call for public comments and would conduct public consultations when it comes to electric tariffs. So this is not what we are speaking about here. We are speaking just general pricing, not regulated prices. Consumers have the right to disclosure of prices for goods and services. So anybody who's advertising a good, a service, is required to put a price. And we see that a lot, especially on social media and especially with small players, individual entrepreneurs, a lot of them would put up something for sale on Facebook or on Instagram without putting a price to it. That is illegal in terms of the CPA, unless you are advertising your shop without advertising seriously the goods. But generally the rule is that you need to display the price, because it relates back to the issue of not discriminating. How do we know that when you say inbox for a price, you are charging different prices to different people depending on their profile? So it's something that people need to understand. Prices need to be displayed, and you pay for what is displayed. If the price is incorrect, or there's a mistake, unless it's corrected, you have to pay what you see. There should be no misleading, fraudulent, or deceptive marketing regarding the price of goods or comparative pricing. No bait marketing. During the pandemic, we saw a lot of bait marketing because consumers had to move to online buying, and your online suppliers were trying to lure consumers to their sites to transact on their sites, and they would usually advertise very low, very high discounted prices. But when consumers tried to access those prices, they were not able to. They would say there is no stock, but you can buy this and that. So bait marketing is prohibited. If stock is limited, they have to indicate that stock is limited. So that is also a pricing issue. There's also, the CPA also prohibits the false, misleading, or deceptive representation regarding the price advantage of goods and services. So in general, those are the rights of consumers and the prohibitions relating to pricing. Now, in terms of the complaints that we received, remember that the lockdown did not only impact on pricing. Because of the restrictions on movement and the restrictions on trading, there were a lot of issues relating to cancellations of flights, cancellations of bookings, and cancellations of fixed-term contracts, people paying for gyms not be able to go to gym. So a majority of our complaints related to lockdown cancellations. 11% to the coronavirus and 7% to price hiking. And remember that the disaster management regulations only spoke to price hiking. Everything else we had to deal of in terms of the CPA and also benchmarking internationally to see what other ombudsmen were doing to deal with issues that arose because of the lockdown. So in those instances, we would then refer the cases to the Competition Commission or the National Consumer Commission. So this is how we dealt with the complaints in terms of the number. A large majority of them, because especially those that related to price hiking, were referred to the National Consumer Commission or the Competition Commission, because remember, we said that we are not a regulatory body, so we do not have enforcement powers. So in those instances, we then referred the cases to the National Consumer Commission and the Competition Commission. So I'm trying to show you the types of complaints that we had to deal with. Okay, so you will see from this slide the types of pricing complaints that we received. We received issues around overcharging, and I suppose those related, especially during the pandemic, to masks, to PEP, and so on. Misleading advertising, like I explained, that a lot of online platforms were not, especially they were also hiding prices. So you would go to a website, they would not disclose that there are delivery charges. They would just say advertise the price, but then when you conclude the transaction, the consumer would then be surprised with additional issues that are charged, but they were not disclosed upfront. Not as per advert, not as per display, that is incorrect pricing. Like I remember I said that the price that you pay is the one that is displayed. You cannot see something on a shelf. When you get to the checkout, it is a different price. Bait marketing, I've explained, price hiking, excessive pricing, and overselling. And I've explained what we did with those complaints. So and I think it is important for people to remember that because we do not have adjudicative powers, we try and assist the parties to come to a resolution based on the information of rights and obligations that we provide to them. If they reach a settlement, happiness. If they don't reach a settlement, the consumer has to lodge a fresh complaint with the National Consumer Commission. Or where we see a trend in terms of the conduct of that particular supplier, we would then report that trend to the National Consumer Commission, and then they can decide whether they want to investigate or not. And sometimes that creates a bit of frustration for consumers, but we have limited jurisdiction and cannot make binding rulings. So I think in conclusion, I want to say that we've learned a lot in the pandemic. Of course, the CPA was not drafted with the pandemic in mind. So there were lots of gaps that were identified. And I think these needs to be addressed in relation to pricing and other complaints and issues that arose. And I think what is important is that the NCC should continue to refer matters to the tribunal, because that also sets precedent and clarifies the act and gives the market direction as what to do. And of course, the role of the ombuds in terms of decision making maybe should be dealt with differently, where we can make certain binding decisions, because we also got frustrated where we saw that a certain supplier, we could have assisted the parties to come to a conclusion of the complaint, but because of our limited powers, we could not do that. I hope this has given you a picture of what we had to deal with in terms of pricing issues. It was broader than price gauging, but yeah, we had to deal with everything that came in terms of resolving the dispute. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mem Patlela. That was quite insightful. I'm happy that you are highlighting that the commission, the ombuds would want to do more, and with the greater support from the policymakers, there could be more work that you are doing. I am also going to make the same call and plea that I've made with the previous regulators, that we communicate to members of the public, contact information, and the manner in which they can contact all these important institutions. Mem Patlela holds an honors degree in applied linguistics and a postgraduate diploma in English education from Wits University. She started her career as a junior lecturer at the Department of Applied Linguistics at Wits University. And this is before she joined the DTIC, where she was instrumental in driving the development and enactment of the National Credit Act, as well as the Consumer Protection Act. She is an accredited court annexed mediator who has previously served as an adjudicator and mediator for the Gauteng Consumer Court, as well as the Gauteng Rental Tribunal. Thank you very much, Mem Patlela. At this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite all the speakers, starting with the Professor, who has really been dealing largely with parallels of the three different waves and the trends in terms of pricing, and some of what he believes could have been the contributing factors to the surge in prices. I've seen, Prof, that there's quite a few questions where we are asked to give a bit of explanation on the balance in terms of the demand and the price hikes that we've seen during that difficult time of the advent of COVID-19. So I would like to give Professor a few minutes to deal with the questions that are appearing on the chat box. I would ask colleagues to assist me in indicating some of the questions that might be left out during these responses. Professor, please take it away.
Thank you for that. Let me, I'm not going to work through all the questions, but I think let me just start by saying that it is a challenge, and if you think about how the Commission regulations have been formulated, focusing on cost-based price increases. So how do you actually deal with demand-based increases? And this is a problem that certainly not just in South Africa, all over the world, policymakers have been grappling with. And not just in terms of the pandemic, but even before, in cases that involve excessive, so-called excessive pricing, which is a very specific type of conduct, the question has often been asked, so how much should we allow demand to drive prices? So if you think about the crisis, there's a sudden surge in demand for an essential item, you don't, so if you follow the logic, the increase in demand will lead to an increase in prices. So should we be worried about that or not? And certainly, and I think that's the position of most policymakers, well, we do worry about that, because if these things are essential items, then the consumer doesn't really have a choice in terms of purchasing something else, or shifting out of the market and maybe avoiding or purchasing later or something. So in those instances, we are inclined to intervene in the markets. In other situations where the demand can be, where the purchase of the product can be postponed, or whether you can think about other potential substitutes, then we might not worry so much. But COVID has created the pandemic, and of course the lockdowns and associated interventions by government has created specific conditions where market power may well be greater. So the ability of a firm to charge a higher price may well be enhanced because consumers have less options. Maybe they don't travel as far. Maybe they have to purchase something locally. And in those conditions, the demand-based increase must be carefully dealt with. And so I think that's the general problem. I see there's a question. There has been a question about, well, what do you do in terms of ensuring access for everybody to a particular product if you see this increase in demand? Well, that is particularly difficult. So you must always remember, the government has a range of policy tools available. So on the one hand, government can try and provide support on the income front, which it has done quite extensively, even if it is limited given the scale of the need. The government has tried to support on the income side people, rather than trying to address the problem from the product side, which is of course another way to try and make something more affordable. But I think the interventions that we have seen, and especially what's also important, and there has been reference to this by some of the previous speakers, is it's not just about getting government to intervene in a legal way or in a kind of heavy-handed way, but it's often also getting consensus in an informal way from different groups to commit to reining in price increases, for example. So we know several big retailers committed to keeping prices or sticking to cost-based price increases or reining in price increases for some items last year. So those kinds of informal agreements, if you want, between government and other sectors of the economy, I think those are also shouldn't be underappreciated. They are quite important. Maybe if you can point me to specific questions, if I quickly scroll through here, I think that captures. Maybe I should.
I think there's one question, Professor, that I would love you to maybe make a comment on.
Okay.
And what is it that can be done to extend powers for the ombuds, and whether you think that there is a need for the ombudsman for goods and services to be expanded?
Well, I think the question is whether this particular agency is properly resourced, given what the relevant act or other policies requires of the agency. That's often, I think, the challenge. So if when we draft legislation or relevant policies, do we actually, and we expect things from our agencies, and we often expect a lot of them, do we actually provide them with the proper resources to at least execute their mandates? I think that's the first challenge. So rather than thinking about extending the powers, which is expanding, changing policies or changing legislation, rather first think about how to best get what we are currently required to do, how to help the agencies best perform those functions. So I think, and there, of course, is that is a much more complex issue, which I'm sure those in government would be a better place to answer than I.
Before I invite Sipho to come in, Prof, the very last question that I think is very important is whether or not the university has some kind of assistance for grassroots organizations, and I think this refers to interest groups who would be watchdogs for price increases.
Mm. Look, I think the university's job is to train students and to get advanced research in a way, maybe so that others can use that. I think the question is, is it part of our job to continuously monitor maybe prices and help businesses in that way? That I think sounds more like a job for a particular government agency. And one should also keep in mind, firstly, that of course there are already initiatives such as the food price monitoring that we've discussed earlier. That is important. And we should also, I think, an important part of this is probably just to help consumers understand where they can find information. So the university is really tries to make its research more accessible to more people. But I think probably, again, our resources are also quite limited, as you can imagine.
I think, Prof, if I may contextualize the question, I think it deals more with training and empowerment in terms of giving them technical understanding of how consumer groups can better engage both regulators as well as policymakers on matters of price increases, not necessarily financial resources.
Yeah. Look, so again, the question is, how do you market that to people, or bring that to people from the university side? I think that's the challenge, and for that, again, we need to have resources to do that. What we try to do within our limited means is try to engage with the Competition Commission and with Parliament and those kinds of institutions. But it is limited, and I guess what you're talking about is really actually getting to consumers themselves. I think that is probably not possible given our resource constraints. I think it is probably something, at least educating consumers about price. I think that is probably something that one can think of government as doing rather than the university.
Thank you very much, Professor Willem Boshoff, ladies and gentlemen, Director for the Center for Competition Law and Economics. At this juncture, I would like to invite Sipho Mtombeni to switch on his video as he deals with some of the questions that I am certain that he has already picked up on the chat box. The one question that interests me, Sipho, is whether or not there is some comparison that the Commission has made in terms of the cases that it has dealt with before COVID-19 and the number of cases it has resolved within the space of the pandemic. So in dealing with your questions, please address that question, Sipho. Thank you very much.
Sure, Sia. So what I've tried to do is respond to as many questions as possible in writing. So I've done so. I will just go through another round of just responses. In terms of the volume of cases that we received, yes, it was quite a high volume of cases that we received. That 2,000 number I mentioned, quite the highest over the number of years. I think we normally receive just about 10% on an annual basis in terms of cases that we would investigate further. I should also just explain that what we also did in the process last year was to also try to make some changes to our procedures to allow people to also approach us either through SMS or through WhatsApp. I'll share those details if you will allow me, Sia, as well, what that process is. So people didn't have to file normal formal complaints. So we allowed consumers, and they're still allowed to this stage, to then either email us the Commission's details, and it is, if I may give it to you now, it is this ccsa@compcom.co.za. So yes, let me just get that up so that you can have it to look at. Then also, you would also be able to either send a message or a WhatsApp to that number 084-743-0000, or also then to contact us via our social media pages. So we have Twitter and Facebook. So we changed our approach in terms of how we do this. So normally somebody is expected to file a CC1, and then we would then conclude an investigation, etc. What we did with these cases, because we noticed the change and the issues that are arising, and that we wouldn't be able to get to address as many issues and people if we were to follow the same approach. So these are our details. And then what happens is that once we get this information from the consumers, we would then follow up with them in terms of the issues that they're raising, the information that they have available. So for instance, in terms of the prices, we allowed stakeholders and people to just send us pictures, for instance, of the receipt for the product for which they applied, for which they paid. And then we would take that information and conduct our investigation to see then what the issues are. So we would then go to either that retailer or the wholesaler. We would then engage them in terms of their pricing. We want to find out if you, for instance, paid 10 Rand for ginger today versus what the prices were some time ago. I think about 100 Rand for ginger, which were some of the issues that we were seeing. We could then engage those retailers and wholesalers and then find out what has been happening in terms of their prices, both before the period in which the COVID came about and after, so that we could see also like their behavior. I mean, I think to a large extent, as Sia, you mentioned earlier, that what was noted by the president and was noted by a lot of people is that this was a change in behavior, where they were taking advantage of the disaster in the area, in the country, and made a conscious decision to then up their prices because of the demands that were happening and the issues that consumers were trying to frantically get these products. So yes, to a long and short answer to you, and I think I've also just tried to address the issue that you asked me earlier, in terms of then how the commission would then deal with this matter. I will also just want to touch on one of the other questions that was received in terms of consumer education and awareness. I am hoping that through the organizers, we'll be able to share some materials for you to read that will also give a bit more guidance in terms of the pricing issues that I've spoken about and how they would relate to you as a consumer, or even those who are businesses in the audience today, which would like to share maybe some of that information, just to increase your awareness beyond this session as well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sipho Tombeni, Principal Analyst, ladies and gentlemen, at the Competition Commission. I think I would like to assume, Sipho, that one of the reasons why this question has been brought forward is whether or not the Commission has got sufficient resources, human and financial resources, in dealing with these cases, and whether or not you are comfortable coping with the kind of workload that the pandemic has actually brought to the Commission, which in my view has become a second layer of the pandemic.
Yes, I mean, so as I mentioned, what we had to do last year, in March of last year, is that we had to change operations. So we had to stop everything else that we're doing in order to deal with these cases that were coming. That meant even pulling out cases for investigators and staff members from their normal jobs, from their normal kind of those who did mergers, people like me who do advocacy. I had to now start investigating cases, which was not necessarily what I used to do before, to try and realign and make sure that we have enough resources. The normal answer I would give is you never have enough resources, but I think we have, as the Commission, made sure to reprioritize and and make sure that we are able to deal with the issues that are arising from these complaints, from the COVID-19 complaints. What can always do with more resources? I think definitely.
So you were doing more with less.
We were doing
the
more.
The commission has been doing more with less. Maybe that is the reason why.
And also I must also mention, and I think some of my team members are watching, because it was a stressful time for all of us as well, because we were also facing the pandemic, also had family members being affected. We were adjusting to working from home and being remote, but we never stopped operations and continued to make sure that we pushed through this. And I know it's been quite acknowledged by some of our colleagues and our commissioner, that the efforts, especially to where we are today, are largely because of the staff of the commission who, despite the challenges that we were facing at that time, had to kind of try to pull through and just make sure that these issues are being addressed, and make sure that the poorest of the poor is not being taken advantage of. And I think that's something that's a priority to all of us, including myself personally. So I think it's something to just to acknowledge to my colleagues who are in the room today as well. Thanks.
Probably the reason, Sipho, that the legislature has decided to increase the grant budget for the commission by another 100 million. I think it's really evident that the commission has been doing great work in terms of flattening the curve for the vulnerable consumers and customers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to move to Mr. Joseph Selelo, who is the company secretary for the National Consumer Commission, which also has been doing great work. We've seen a lot of cases that they had to deal with in conjunction with the Commission and various other regulators. I would like to now request Mr. Joseph Selelo to switch on his video and maybe deal with some of the questions. And in the interest of time, the other speakers may also use the opportunity to just address some of the questions on our chat box, which obviously have been raised by the members of the public. I do wish to invite members of the public who are joining us from our YouTube, Facebook, and all other social media platforms. We are rolling with the hashtag pricing regulation, consumer protection, hashtag consumer protection. So as you make comments in those public platforms, do remember to tag us on those hashtags. Mr. Joseph Selelo of the National Consumer Commission, please take it away.
Thank you, Sia. All right. There are questions that I will deal with. There's a question by Tsepang Ramusipili and anonymous attendee. These two questions are sort of related, and I will deal with them in one go. So the first one says, how are consumers protected against substandard products which are imported? The second one says, there has been a scourge of fake goods manufacturers. What is being done to protect consumers from these fake operators? Now, the Consumer Protection Act specifically states in Section 55 that consumers have a right to goods that are safe and of good quality. Now, when you go deeper, it says the goods must be reasonably suited for the purpose for which they are generally intended, and must be free of any defects, and must be usable and durable for a reasonable period of time, and must comply with any applicable standard set under the Standards Act, that's the South African Standards Act, or any other public regulation. Now, what happens is when goods are imported in the Republic, one then needs to check if those goods are they regulated goods. If they are, you will find that then the national regulator for compulsory standards is then responsible to conduct inspections, and when goods don't meet the regulated standards, they then confiscate those goods. Those goods cannot be sold in the Republic. But it does happen that some goods do escape and end up in the market. When a consumer receives such a good, the consumer must then lodge a complaint with us. Then we will investigate whether those goods meet the standards or they don't. Where they do not meet the standards, then the supplier of those goods would have been in contravention and will be prosecuted. We need to distinguish between fake, in a sense that it infringes another's intellectual property, or that fake in a sense that it is substandard. If it simply infringes another's intellectual property, it is the owner of that intellectual property who must then take actions to protect their own intellectual property. Sandra Dixon asks a question and that says, does Regulation 350, by which a price should correspond to the cost of providing a service, have any correspondence to legislation and definition for municipalities when tariffs are set? Now, Regulation 350 contains an exclusion in itself. It states that it is applicable to specific items, and it lists them. It is applicable to foodstuffs, the prices of food during the pandemic, and the prices of emergency supplies, as well as medicines. And it has a list. So this regulation, it is not applicable to municipal tariffs. It is specific to food, your protective equipment, essentially the things that you will need during the pandemic to protect yourself. Thabo Chauke asks a question that says, does the Competition Commission or National Consumer Commission not concerned about companies, often organized ones, when they lodge applications to government requesting protection against anti-dumping? It can be argued that anti-dumping measures is inimical to the goals of the competition policy. Now, in terms of the Consumer Protection Act, there are listed products, and those are footwear, leather clothing or leather products, and textile products. These products are required to meet certain requirements in terms of the Consumer Protection Act. When these goods do not meet those requirements, those goods cannot enter the Republic. The importation thereof is then prohibited. If those goods are then imported at the port of entry, those goods are detained, and the importer is then directed to re-export those goods back to the country of origin or to destroy them. Those goods must be re-exported off the African continent, so they cannot be dumping as such. However, I need to mention that dumping and anti-dumping, I believe that they are dealt with by the International Trade Commission in South Africa. they are not necessarily what our mandate is about. So there is a specific commission that deals with dumping and anti-dumping. The Consumer Protection Act only selects specific products that it visits for specifically to prevent them, the dumping of those, the footwear, leather, and textiles. Another question asked that is consideration given to the fact that suppliers are required to make profits in order to keep their business running. The author says, I understand that pricing regulations during COVID does not allow them to increase prices unless there are cost increases. Where they are unable to do so, they then start to retrench workers and put us on short time. How does government plan to deal with this unintended consequence? Earlier on, when I was talking about the provisions of the CPA, I referred to section 49. That is an error. It's actually section 40, subsection 1. That deals with the unfair and unreasonable and unjust price. However, when you look at the regulation that then gives the definition, it then says that there must be a correspondence between the cost of procuring the good and the increase. Now, we need to understand that the regulations are COVID specific. This does not mean that suppliers cannot increase their prices. All along prior to COVID, there has been always annual increases. Now, the regulations go further to state that the effect of the price increase that you as a supplier will then levy must not increase the net margin or your markup on that good above your average markup for at least 3 months before 1 March. What does this mean? It means over the years, you've always been increasing prices. You have always been adding a markup on the goods that you procure. And over that period, we are able to determine your average markup. But what have we seen during COVID? The masks, except for now the cloth masks, the surgical masks that we've always, that we started off wearing, they've always been sold in the Republic. They were generally worn by the medical staff, and we also had the ones that were worn in the construction industry, worn by people that spray painters to protect themselves. Those masks were always being sold and were sold at a particular price. But enter COVID. We then had suppliers seeking to take advantage of the fact that there is now COVID and this will then be in demand. And they started increasing their prices exorbitantly. When you look at their markup, you would notice that they would, for example, be levying an 11% markup ordinarily. Suddenly there's COVID, we then found 500% markup, 700, 1,000%. So in essence, what cost 50 rands before 1 March 2020 suddenly costs 500 rands. When you look at the percentage, you then can see that this price is increased specifically to take advantage of the presence of COVID in the Republic to the detriment of the South African populace. Now, this increase is not an increase that is designed to necessarily make your usual profit. It is that type of conduct that this regulation seeks to visit. And that's why we have seen these types of fines being levied against these companies, and companies being forced to then donate this protective wear to remove the proceeds of their contraventions. Thanks, Sia. I believe I've dealt with the questions.
You have certainly been able to deal with most of the questions. The one question that I would love you to deal with is the issue that has got to do with the National Treasury. There's a question, I think, from Anonymous, which is asking that the National Treasury makes determination on some of the prices on PPEs. And the question is, why are suppliers not adhering to those predetermined prices?
All right. So those prices are prices that the National Treasury set for public entities. So it is government that is then procuring services. Now, I will not speculate as to the reason why those suppliers were exorbitant. However, I need to specify something, that the Consumer Protection Act only protects consumers directly, but it is not applicable where the recipient of the service is government. So government needs to find mechanisms to protect itself, as we see it happening with the SIU investigations. So I believe that's the mechanism that the government then protects itself through. But the Consumer Protection Act does not have application in that relationship. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prajo. At this juncture, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite Mem Patlele to just deal with some of the questions which I do not see much on our chat box, but maybe use the opportunity to offer us some closing remarks. Mem Patlele.
Thank you so much, our facilitator. And thank you for this opportunity. Like I said, the Consumer Goods and Services Ombudsman is there to resolve disputes before they are escalated to the regulators for formal investigation. So it is the first step to try and allow the parties to reach an amicable settlement or resolution under our guidance recommendation. The supplier is not under obligation to accept our recommendation. Where they do not, or whether the supplier makes an offer to the consumer and the consumer does not accept it, then the consumer has to file a new complaint with the regulator, because the regulator can then investigate the matter and, if so necessary, either issue a compliance notice or refer the matter to the National Consumer Tribunal, which is the adjudicative body. That is how the CPA is structured. It sometimes causes frustration to consumers to say, why can't you make a final decision? Unfortunately, that is how the Act is structured, and that is how we deal with the issues. Consumers can reach us in different platforms. They can lodge their complaints directly on our website. They can call us on 0860 000 272. We have a Facebook page, Consumer Goods and Services Ombudsman. They can ask us questions there. They can inbox us any issues. Like I said, our website, we also have a WhatsApp number where they can ask questions, 081 335 3005. We are also on Twitter. We are on LinkedIn. So all the social media platforms, we try and educate consumers about their rights and obligations, as well as suppliers. An important thing to note is that you can trust those suppliers that show this logo on their websites and on their window fronts, because that says that they belong to the Ombud. If you have any complaint against them, they will deal with it, because we have seen there are a lot of websites that are popping up. Consumers are buying on those websites. They are being scammed, money is being taken, goods not being delivered. So be very careful who you are trading with. If you see this logo, at least you have confirmation that that supplier subscribes to the code, complies with the CPA, and if they are not able to help you with your queries, they will allow you to escalate to us, or if we receive complaints against them, we will be able to escalate to them. Those that are not, they are difficult to find, and sometimes they do not respond to complaints. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mem Patlela. I would request you to please, with your permission, maybe upload the presentation on the chat box so that those who still have access to the chat box can go back to it and be able to capture the information in terms of the contact details and the process they need to follow in terms of lodging their complaints.
Okay,
I'm going
not
to request.
Clever. How do you do that?
We can then ask Nadia to help us with that.
Yeah, she's
I don't know,
got
Nadia,
the
if you do have the presentation.
Thank you.
Please upload it on the chat box. I'll now invite, as I thank Mem Patlela for the informative and comprehensive presentation, invite Professor Willem Boshoff to just make closing remarks and just highlight some of the things that he might have left off during the Q&A.
Thank you. Yes, I think at the end of the day, we need to be careful about, as I said in my opening remarks, what drives price increases. And I think at the end of the day, if it is, especially if it's demand-led price increases, you know, a lot of the interventions that we have seen over the past year are modeled on similar types of regulations that were created to respond to natural disasters. So if you had in the US a hurricane, for example, there are price gouging laws that tells you, well, suddenly there's a demand for food or something in the affected area, and you are not allowed to charge excessive prices during this crisis period that follows the hurricane or some other earthquake or some other natural disaster. Now, in our case, we are dealing with a disaster that is prolonged, and that creates unique challenges for us all, because on the one hand, you want to control excessive pricing and price gouging and all sorts of other offenses. But on the other hand, because it's such a long period, you also need to be very careful to allow demand to push prices a little bit higher in some areas to make sure that you get the increased supply of the goods on the shelves. So I think that's going to be the major challenge, for most of the agencies as we go ahead, as we move away from those initial lockdown periods and perhaps cases that focus on them. How you actually deal with cases of very high prices or very sharp price increases is going to become much more complicated than they have been so far. I think with that's going to be our main challenge. And other than that, I think one should always keep in mind that the agencies can only help you so far. You cannot monitor all prices. You cannot intervene in all cases. So it really is, I think the matter that this was raised earlier, a question of educating consumers so that they are able themselves to judge whether something is wrong or not. That's going to be important. And of course, we should continue working, as I believe we are all trying to do, to get the economy growing again and increasing the number of businesses entering and expanding, because that increases competition, that reduces the ability of particular firms to charge high prices, and that helps everybody. So I think I will end up with on that general point.
Thank you very much, Professor. A collaborative effort and a concerted effort by all key role players that seeks to ensure that we grow an inclusive economy for the benefit of all South Africans, which obviously has got an impact on our day-to-day lives, including the surge that we've seen in prices in the first, second, and the third wave. I don't know, Professor, with your permission, if I should be sharing your email address for those who would like to be in contact with you.
You're very welcome.
Professor is available, ladies and gentlemen, on WIMPie, WIMPIE, number 2 at sun.ac.za. I'll repeat, WIMPIE, number 2 at sun.ac.za. Thank you very much, Professor, and thank you for joining us. At this stage, I would like to invite Sipho Mtombeni from the Competition Commission to make his final remarks.
Yes, thanks. I think I'd like to echo some of the words from the Prof there, that it is quite an interesting time ahead of us now. I think as a country, when we're looking to recover our economy, a lot of our efforts, even at the Commission, would be also to ensure that we align ourselves with government's efforts to make sure that South Africa's economy is recovered. And obviously, everything that we've done thus far was in reaction to a pandemic and a disaster that we were not really prepared for, or that we're not maybe not ready for in some times. We've had some opportunity now, a year or so later, to kind of consider our positions and see where we are. But I think to a large extent, we look forward to engaging with our fellow regulators as we have till now, hence the collaboration part. But I think to a large extent, it is quite important to have, and for the stakeholders in the room to know their importance in ensuring that these outcomes are seen. So for consumers to come and inform us of any complaints, from businesses who are unsure about their conduct and whether it's anti-competitive, they can gladly come forward and speak to us. So the collaboration is not just between us and the NCC or the other bodies within here, but again, also with society, with civil society, with the consumers, and we look forward to further engagement further in there. Thanks.
Further engagement, ladies and gentlemen, Sipho Mtombeni from the Competition Commission. This is one of the comments that we've seen on our chat box, where some of the participants have been commending the DTIC and its agencies for this kind of stakeholder engagement, with the plea that there should be more of these, and this should be done quite often. Sipho Mtombeni, Principal Analyst from the Competition Commission of South Africa. Those who would like to know more about the role that Sipho is playing at the Commission, Sipho is available on sipho@compcom.co.za, sipho@compcom.co.za. I now would like to invite Mr. Joseph Selolo, who's the Company Secretary for the National Consumer Commission, to please round it off for us today.
Thank you, Sia. I think it is fair to say that, as everyone has said, that the pandemic was something that none of us could have anticipated or predicted. What we have seen is a number of evils, not only this price gouging that we're talking about, but in the consumer space, we have seen also the pyramid schemes, and some of you would have been aware of the Up Money Pyramid scheme that we, together with other law enforcement agencies, work together to bring it to a stop. We have recently seen another one that we will shortly be briefing the media about. There is such an increase, and there is also an increase in online scams for online shoppers. So through education, we try to educate the consumers that the first line of defense is the consumer themselves, in ensuring that they try to transact with reputable suppliers to avoid being scammed out of money that we do not have as a result of the job losses we've seen in the Republic. We encourage South Africans to then continue to lodge complaints with us in as far as these price gouging activities are concerned, and we will continue to investigate to try and give relief to the consumers. Thank you, Sia, and thank you to my fellow panelists.
Thank you very much, Mr. Joseph Selolo from the National Consumer Commission. Both regulators, ladies and gentlemen, are calling for the consumers to rise and come forward with all sorts of complaints where they pick up that there's been a contravention or exploitation. And also, I would like to use this opportunity to remind consumers that at the time of making these complaints, please make sure that you've got as much information as possible, including the receipts of purchase, the name of the supplier against which you would be complaining, the physical address, and if possible, the contact details of such a supplier, as this makes it easier for the screening and investigation team to follow up on your complaints. I would like to use this opportunity to thank all our speakers for their valuable and comprehensive, informative presentations, but also some case studies on some of the complaints that were investigated during this time. I would also use the opportunity to thank the DTIC, the Competition Commission, proudly South African, as well as the Ombuds for consumers and goods and services, for affording South Africans and all stakeholders an opportunity to interact with these key stakeholders as we navigate the pandemic of COVID-19. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.